5 minutes. That is all this requires. Not an hour of journaling before dawn, not a cold plunge and a meditation cushion and a carefully curated morning stack, not a complete overhaul of your routine or your schedule or your lifestyle. 5 minutes at the end of the day in the dark before your eyes close, and what happens next in the hours of sleep that follow is something that most people have never been told is even possible. Here is what you already know. You go to bed tired, you wake up, and not much has changed. The same thoughts are waiting, the same resistance, the same ceiling. You work hard during the day, you rest at night, and the cycle continues as if the wiring underneath everything is simply fixed, simply given, simply the hand you were dealt. And you have probably stopped questioning that assumption, because questioning it leads somewhere that feels dangerously close to hope, and hope has let you down before. Napoleon Hill questioned it. He questioned it systematically across decades in the lives of hundreds of men and women who had started where you are and arrived somewhere completely. And what he found about those 5 minutes before sleep, about what the brain is doing during sleep, and about how deliberate practice in those final waking moments rewires the mind from the inside out is both older than modern neuroscience and more precisely confirmed by it than almost anyone realizes. Before we go into all of that, I want to ask you one thing. What do those last 5 minutes before sleep currently look like for you? Scrolling, worrying, just collapsing? Be honest in the comments. What you find there might surprise you. Most people do not think of sleep as a time when anything productive is happening. Sleep is rest. Sleep is the pause between days. The mind goes quiet, the body repairs, the conscious experience stops, and 8 hours later, you pick up roughly where you left off. That is the ordinary understanding. And it is so incomplete that accepting it is, in Hill's framing, one of the most quietly expensive beliefs a person can carry. Napoleon Hill believed and wrote about this with unusual precision for someone working without the benefit of modern sleep science, that the hours of sleep are not a pause in the work of the mind. They are the deepest, most active phase of it. He described the subconscious mind as tireless, an intelligence that does not sleep when the conscious mind does, but that continues working, processing, consolidating, and creating throughout the night with a thoroughness and a creativity that the waking mind cannot match. The night, in Hill's framework, is not empty time. It is when the real construction happens. And what gets constructed depends entirely on what instructions were given in those last few minutes before sleep. Hill wrote about the subconscious mind as an entity that functions most powerfully in the absence of conscious interference. During the day, the analytical, skeptical, evaluating conscious mind is always present, filtering, questioning, interrupting. It is useful for many things, but it is also the primary obstacle between a new belief and the subconscious that needs to receive it. In sleep, that obstacle steps aside. The filtering drops, the door opens, and what enters through that open door in the final moments before sleep, what is held clearly and emotionally in the mind as consciousness fades, is received by the subconscious with a directness and a depth that daytime effort rarely achieves. This is where the 5-minute habit lives. Not in the morning, not in the middle of a busy afternoon, not in a dedicated practice session with a timer and a journal and a candle. In the last 5 minutes before the day ends, when the analytical mind is already loosening its grip and the deeper intelligence is beginning to come forward. Hill identified this transition as one of the most powerful leverage points in the entire human experience. And almost no one is using it deliberately. Think of it like irrigation. A farmer who waters during the heat of the day loses much of what he puts in to evaporation. The conditions work against absorption. The same farmer watering at dusk, when the heat is dropped and the soil is cool and receptive, delivers far more water to the roots with far less effort. The water is the same. The timing changes everything. The 5-minute habit works on the same principle. The material you are working with, your intentions, your desired beliefs, your vision of what you are building is the same material you might engage with during the day. But placed at the threshold of sleep, it enters somewhere that daylight effort rarely reaches. There was a man I once heard described who had spent years trying to change a deep pattern of anxious thinking, the kind that colored everything, that made good news feel fragile and bad news feel confirming. He had tried therapy, meditation, journaling, behavioral strategies. All of them helped, partially, temporarily, but the pattern kept reasserting itself as if it had roots deeper than any of those practices were reaching. A turning point came when he began paying deliberate attention to what he was doing in those last minutes before sleep. What he found was that he was, without exception, spending those minutes in a low-grade mental replay of everything that had worried him that day, a faithful nightly rehearsal of exactly the anxious patterns he was trying to change. He was, in Hill's language, using the most receptive window of his day to reinforce precisely the wiring he wanted to undo. When he changed what those 5 minutes contained, the pattern began to shift in a way nothing else had managed to produce. In the modern world, the 5 minutes before sleep have been colonized almost completely by the smartphone, not because people are careless or self-destructive, but because the phone is there, the content is engineered to capture attention, and no one has ever told most people that those particular 5 minutes are worth protecting with unusual care. The algorithmic feed that fills those minutes is not neutral. It is selected for emotional activation for the content most likely to produce a reaction strong enough to keep you watching. And emotionally activated content delivered in the final minutes of waking consciousness goes into the subconscious with exactly the depth and directness that Hill described. The phone is using the same leverage point Hill identified. It is simply using it in the opposite direction. The reframe is not that you need to be perfect every night or that a single night of scrolling has undone your progress. The reframe is that you have been sitting on one of the most powerful 5-minute windows available to you every single night of your life without anyone ever telling you what it could be used for. What would you use it for if you knew what you now know? The 5-minute habit Hill described is built on a practice he called autosuggestion, but in its specifically nocturnal form, it has a texture and a quality that is different from any other time of day. He believed that as the conscious mind relaxes towards sleep, a unique receptivity opens a state in which the subconscious is not merely listening, but absorbing, not merely recording, but integrating. What you deliver to it in that state does not sit on the surface. It goes in. Hill was clear that the practice had to contain specific elements to work at this level. The first was clarity, not a vague feeling of wanting things to be better, but a precisely defined image of the state or outcome being sought. The subconscious navigates toward targets. A fog is not a target. A clear, specific, detailed mental image held long enough to feel real, returned to consistently enough to become familiar, is something the subconscious can actually work with through the hours of sleep. The second element was emotion. Hill described this as the critical ingredient that most people omit, which is exactly why most people's attempts at this kind of practice produce disappointing results. He wrote that the subconscious mind responds to the language of feeling, not the language of words. Words alone, repeated without genuine emotional engagement, are like instructions written in a language the subconscious does not speak. But a thought, even a brief one, even a simple one, that carries genuine emotional weight, that is felt as real rather than merely thought as possible, enters the deeper mind with a force and a staying power that cold repetition cannot match. The feeling is the delivery mechanism. Without it, the message does not arrive. The third element was repetition. Not the frantic, effortful repetition of someone trying to force a result, but the patient, consistent, nightly return to the same practice, the same image, the same feeling given to the subconscious at the same receptive threshold night after night until it becomes not an activity but an orientation, until the new material is not something you are practicing but something you have become. Hill understood that the subconscious does not transform overnight. It transforms through accumulation, through the quiet compound interest of returning daily to the same deliberate instruction, trusting that each night's deposit is doing something even when the evidence is not yet visible. Think of the nightly practice as tuning an instrument. You do not tune a piano once and expect it to stay in tune forever. You return regularly, you make the small adjustments, you listen carefully, and over time, the instrument holds its pitch more reliably, responds more immediately, resonates more fully when played. The mind, rewired by 5 minutes of deliberate nightly practice, is not a different instrument. It is the same instrument, tuned more carefully and returned to more consistently until what it produces is something genuinely different from what it produced before. There was a young woman I once heard described who had a specific professional goal that felt just far enough out of reach to remain perpetually aspirational rather than actively pursued. She wanted it genuinely, but there was always a reason it was not quite the right time, a qualification she still needed, a connection she hadn't made yet, a level of readiness she hadn't quite reached. The honest assessment, when she finally made it, was that the goal felt safer as an aspiration than as an attempt. An attempt could fail specifically. She began the 5-minute practice not by trying to make herself feel ready. She could not manufacture that feeling from the outside, but by holding each night before sleep the specific felt image of the person she was on the other side of the attempt. Not the success exactly. The person. The version of herself that had tried and was therefore different regardless of outcome. Within weeks, the nature of her daily choices began to shift in ways she had not engineered consciously. The subconscious, given a clear and felt instruction every night, had simply started navigating. The 5-minute habit is not magic. It is the most efficient use of the most receptive window in your day. And once you understand what that window actually is, it is almost impossible to think about going back to using it for scrolling. Here is where the 5-minute habit becomes something more than a bedtime ritual, where it connects to something Hill understood about the relationship between sleep and what he called the creative intelligence of the subconscious mind. Hill was fascinated by the phenomenon of solutions arriving from sleep. Not the vague inspiration that might come from a good night's rest, but specific, creative, fully formed answers to problems that deliberate waking thought had failed to solve. He had observed this in the lives of the extraordinary individuals he studied. Edison's famous half-sleep experiments, the musician who woke with the melody complete, the businessman who found clarity in the night that the boardroom could not produce. And he understood it not as coincidence or mystery, but as the natural product of a subconscious mind given a clear question and the uninterrupted space of sleep to work on it. Hill believed that the subconscious, properly instructed, functions during sleep as a creative, problem-solving intelligence of remarkable capability. He described the practice of presenting a specific problem or intention to the subconscious in those final minutes before sleep, not anxiously, not with the tense grip of someone demanding an answer, but with the relaxed expectation of someone who trusts that the work is being done and then releasing it, going to sleep, letting the deeper intelligence take over and bringing in the first quiet moments of waking, a willingness to receive what arrived. Neuroscience has since provided the scaffolding for what Hill was describing. During REM sleep, the phase associated with dreaming, With emotional processing and with the consolidation of memory, the brain actively connects information across categories in ways that waking cognition rarely achieves. Researchers studying sleep and creativity have found that problems presented before sleep are more likely to produce novel solutions in the period just after waking. The brain, during sleep, is not filing and storing passively. It is cross-referencing, associating, finding patterns and connections that the narrowly focused waking mind misses. The subconscious intelligence Hill described as working through the night is, in neurological terms, the sleeping brain's remarkable capacity for integrative processing. Think of it like delegating to the best analyst you have ever worked with, one who works through the night, never gets tired, never gets distracted, and consistently returns with solutions that your more visible, noisier efforts failed to find. The 5-minute habit is the briefing. Sleep is the working session. Morning, if you meet it with a moment of stillness rather than immediately picking up the phone, is when you collect the output. There was a man I once heard about who had been wrestling with a decision for months. One of those decisions where both paths had genuine merit and genuine cost, and where the analytical mind kept producing equally compelling arguments for each side. He had listed pros and cons, consulted everyone he trusted, and still could not locate the clarity he needed. Someone suggested he try Hill's method, not to force an answer, but to hand the question to something that might handle it differently. He wrote the question clearly before sleep, held it briefly and honestly in his mind as he settled, and then released it, rather than lying awake, turning it over. On the third morning, before he reached for his phone, something was simply there. Not a logical argument, a settled knowing, clear, complete, undramatic. He made the decision that morning and never second-guessed it. This is the gift that the 5-minute habit, practiced consistently, eventually delivers, not just the nightly instruction toward a desired state, but the gradual development of a relationship with an inner intelligence that is far more capable than the anxious, overworked conscious mind tends to be given credit for. There is a version of this practice that Hill described with particular emphasis, one that connects the 5-minute habit specifically to the question of self-belief. Because self-belief, in Hill's understanding, is not a fixed trait. It is a condition of the inner climate. And the inner climate, shaped night by night at the threshold of sleep, is one of the most directly modifiable aspects of a person's psychology. Most people carry a level of self-belief that was largely set in childhood and has been reinforced or undermined by the experiences of the years since. It does not feel like a belief. It feels like an honest self-assessment, like clear-eyed knowledge of what you are and are not capable of. And this is precisely what makes it so difficult to shift through conscious effort alone, because the conscious mind is doing its evaluation through the lens of the very belief it is trying to change. The belief evaluates the evidence that would challenge the belief. It is a closed loop. Hill understood that the way out of that loop is not through the conscious mind. It is around it. The 5-minute habit practiced at the threshold of sleep, when the analytical, evaluating conscious mind is relaxing its grip, works in the gap that opens between waking and sleeping. It is in that gap that a new self-concept can be delivered to the subconscious without passing through the filter that would normally reject it. Not by lying to yourself, not by claiming certainty you do not feel, but by holding, with genuine feeling and genuine specificity, the image of the person you are becoming clearly enough, consistently enough, and at the right moment of receptivity until the subconscious begins to treat that image as accurate rather than aspirational. This is how the habit rewires. Not in a single dramatic moment, but through nightly deposits that compound invisibly, changing the inner climate degree by degree until the day arrives when you notice, not quite sure when it happened, that the old loop is no longer running, that something underneath has shifted, that the self who wakes up and moves through the day is operating from a slightly different foundation. And slightly different foundations over years produce lives that are not slightly different, but unrecognizably improved. There was a woman I once read about who had carried a specific inner conviction for most of her adult life, the conviction that she was someone who started things and did not finish them. She had evidence for it, real evidence, a record of genuinely incomplete projects and abandoned pursuits. But the conviction had grown larger than the evidence. It had become an identity, and identities once formed are extraordinarily good at generating further evidence for themselves. She began the 5-minute practice focused not on any specific external goal, but on one thing only, a clear, felt image of herself as someone who completes, who finishes, who sees things through. She held it each night, briefly and honestly, without forcing emotion, but allowing whatever genuine feeling she could contact. Over months, the identity began to shift. Not all at once, but when she looked back a year later, the record looked different. And more importantly, the inner narrator had changed its story. If what you are reading here is connecting with something real, if the idea of the 5-minute habit feels like the missing piece of something you have been trying to assemble for a while, consider that someone in your life might need this exact conversation. Not the whole series, just this one piece. The right idea at the right moment can do more for a person than a library of good intentions. Hill's 5-minute habit, at its deepest level, is not really about 5 minutes. It is about the decision. Those 5 minutes represent the decision to stop treating sleep as nothing more than rest and to start treating the threshold between waking and sleep as the portal it actually is. A portal not to somewhere else, but to the deepest layer of the same self who will wake up tomorrow and decide what to do with the day. The people Hill studied the extraordinary achievers whose mental practices he spent decades cataloging were not using different brains. They were using the same brain differently. They had discovered through various routes and in various forms that the mind's most capable intelligence is not the one that runs the meetings and writes the plans and makes the calls. It is the quieter one, the one that works while everything else is still, the one that processes and creates and integrates and solves in the dark, while the ego and the analysis and the self-doubt are all for once out of the way. The 5-minute habit is the practice of giving that quiet intelligence something worth working on. And here, at the end of this journey, is the reversal worth sitting with as you go. You began here perhaps thinking of this as a habit to acquire something, to add to the stack of things you are already trying to do and be. But the truth is that you are already practicing a 5-minute habit before sleep. Every night, without exception, something fills those final minutes. A worry, a scroll, a replay of the day's disappointments, a low-grade rehearsal of tomorrow's anxieties. You have never not been using this window. You've only been using it without knowing what you were doing. Napoleon Hill's contribution is not to give you a new practice. It is to give you the knowledge that you have always been practicing so that you can finally choose what to practice deliberately. The brain being rewired every night while you sleep has always been yours. The only question that has ever mattered is whose instructions it has been working from. If exploring the deeper architecture of how the human mind builds a life feels like a conversation worth continuing, the kind of understanding that accumulates rather than expires, the next chapter of it is already here. Not behind a button to click, but on the other side of the decision to keep going. The most interesting parts of this journey are always ahead. 5 minutes. Tonight. Choose deliberately.